How would you react if you buried your husband last week and then saw proof he was still alive yesterday? I'm not asking that question as some dramatic thought experiment. I'm asking because it happened to me. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. My name is Eleanor Whitaker. I'm 67 years old. I spent most of my life working as a school librarian in a quiet town called Maplewood. The kind of town where nothing shocking ever happens. The kind where everyone knows everyone. Where the biggest news of the week is usually someone's dog getting loose or the high school football team winning a game. But a week ago, I stood in the rain and watched them lower my husband's coffin into the ground. 45 years of marriage. Gone in a single afternoon. They told me Thomas died in a car crash on Highway 17. A terrible accident, they said. His car went off the road late at night and caught fire. The police report claimed the impact was so severe, there was nothing left to identify. No viewing. Closed casket. The funeral happened fast. Too fast. At the time, I thought it was just the way tragedies worked. When someone dies suddenly, people rush through the details. Paperwork. Arrangements. Phone calls. My son Daniel handled most of it. Daniel is 40 years old now. Married to his wife Melissa, with an 8-year-old boy named Lucas. Daniel kept saying the same thing over and over. "Mom, you shouldn't see the body. It's better this way." Everyone nodded in agreement. The funeral director said the same thing. The condition of the remains would make viewing very difficult. So I trusted them. Because when grief hits you like a wave, you don't think clearly. You just hold on to whatever explanation people give you. The funeral was last Tuesday. Cold rain fell the entire time. I remember staring at the black umbrella above me while the pastor spoke about Thomas being a good man. A loyal husband. A devoted father. A man who loved fishing on early Saturday mornings. All of that was true. Thomas Whitaker was 69 years old. A mechanic for most of his life. Quiet. Patient. The kind of man who fixed things instead of throwing them away. Cars. Lawnmowers. Broken kitchen chairs. Sometimes even people. We had been married since I was 22. And in 45 years, Thomas never kept secrets from me. At least, that's what I believed. But something about the week before his death had been strange. 3 days before the crash, Thomas received a phone call while we were eating dinner. I remember the moment clearly because he almost dropped his fork when the phone rang. He looked at the screen. And his entire expression changed. "Who is it?" I asked. "Wrong number," he said quickly. But instead of declining the call, he stood up and walked outside to answer it. That wasn't like him. Thomas hated talking on the phone. He stayed outside for almost 10 minutes. When he came back in, his face looked pale. Not sick. Not angry. Just worried. I asked him what was wrong. He shook his head. "Nothing, Ellie. Just someone asking about the property." The property. That meant the land behind our house. 10 acres Thomas inherited from his father years ago. A piece of land he refused to sell no matter how many offers came through town. I didn't think much about it at the time. But as he stood at the sink washing his hands, he suddenly said something that stuck with me. Something that felt strange even then. "If anything ever happens to me, trust your instincts." I laughed. "Thomas, what kind of thing is that to say?" He shrugged like it meant nothing. But now I realize something. People don't say things like that for no reason. Still, life went on. 3 days later, I got the call from Daniel telling me there had been an accident. And just like that, Thomas was gone. Or at least, that's what I believed. Until yesterday afternoon. I was sitting at the kitchen table, trying to read a book I couldn't focus on, when I heard the front door slam open. My grandson Lucas came running inside like he'd just discovered buried treasure. "Grandma! Grandma!" He was out of breath, his backpack half falling off his shoulder. "What is it, sweetheart?" I asked. His eyes were wide. Excited. Confused. "Grandma. I saw Grandpa yesterday." For a moment I just stared at him. Children say strange things sometimes. Especially after losing someone they love. So I smiled gently and said, "Lucas. Grandpa passed away, remember?" But he shook his head immediately. "No. I really saw him." Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. I even took a picture. And when he handed me that phone, I felt the world tilt beneath my feet. Because the photo on that screen wasn't old. It wasn't blurry. And it wasn't someone who looked similar. It was Thomas. My husband. Standing outside Maplewood Market. Alive. But what froze my blood wasn't just the fact that my supposedly dead husband was standing there. It was the man standing beside him. Because that man was someone Thomas had once sworn he would never trust. And in that moment, I realized something that made my stomach drop. Maybe my husband didn't die in a car crash. Maybe my family lied. And if that was true, then what I uncovered next would be even more disturbing. Let me ask you something. What would you do if you were holding proof that someone you buried was still walking around town? Would you assume it's fake? Would you convince yourself your eyes are playing tricks on you? Or would you start wondering if everything you've been told is a lie? Because that was exactly the moment I found myself in. I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at Lucas's phone, and my hands had started to shake. The photo looked completely normal at first glance. A sunny afternoon outside Maplewood Market. The small grocery store on Pine Street where most of the town buys their food. The glass doors were visible in the background. The red shopping carts lined up along the wall. And standing just a few feet from the entrance was my husband. Thomas Whitaker. Alive. He was wearing the same blue canvas jacket he'd owned for years. The one with the frayed cuffs that I kept telling him to replace. His gray hair was combed the same way. His posture. His shoulders. Even the small scar above his left eyebrow, the one he got 30 years ago when a wrench slipped in his garage. It was him. There was no question about it. No possibility of confusion. And then I noticed the timestamp in the corner of the photo. Yesterday. 4:12 p.m. My chest tightened. Because according to everyone in my family, Thomas had been dead for 8 days. I slowly looked up at Lucas. "Where did you take this?" I asked. He pointed toward the street outside. "At the store," he said. "Mom sent me to get milk after school." His voice was completely calm. Like this was the most ordinary thing in the world. But for me, nothing about this moment felt ordinary. "Lucas," I said carefully, "did Grandpa see you?" He nodded. "Well." I yelled his name. My heart skipped. "You did?" "Yeah," he said. I said Grandpa, really loud. I leaned closer. "And then what happened?" Lucas frowned slightly, trying to remember. He looked at me. That sentence sent a chill through me. "Are you sure?" "Yeah." But then the other man grabbed his arm. The other man. That's when I looked back at the photo. And really studied it. Standing beside Thomas was a tall man in a dark coat. His face partially turned toward the parking lot. But I recognized him instantly. Victor Hale. If you live in Maplewood, you know that name. Victor Hale is 62 years old and owns half the commercial property in this town. Shopping centers. Apartment buildings. Warehouses. A developer. The kind of man who always shows up in expensive suits and shiny black cars. But the thing about Victor Hale is this. My husband hated him. Years ago, Victor tried to buy the land behind our house. 10 acres that had been in Thomas's family for generations. Victor offered a lot of money. More than most people in Maplewood would ever see in their lifetime. But Thomas said no. Not once. Not twice. 3 times. And the last time they spoke, it wasn't polite. I remember that afternoon clearly. Victor showed up at our house unannounced. Stepped out of a black SUV wearing sunglasses and a smile that never reached his eyes. Thomas met him on the porch. I watched the whole conversation through the kitchen window. Victor kept talking. Calm. Smooth. Thomas kept shaking his head. Finally Victor said something that made Thomas stiffen. I couldn't hear the words through the glass. But I saw Thomas point toward the road. Leave. Victor didn't argue. He simply smiled. And before getting back in his car, he said something I heard clearly when the door opened. Everyone has a price, Thomas. Thomas answered immediately. Not me. After that day, Victor Hale never came back. Or at least, we thought he didn't. Now here he was in Lucas's photo. Standing next to my supposedly dead husband. I felt a slow wave of dread building in my stomach. Lucas, I said, what happened after you yelled for Grandpa? Lucas shifted his backpack on his shoulder. He looked scared. That word hit me like ice water. Scared? Lucas nodded. Yeah. Like when Dad gets mad at the dog. I glanced back at the photo. Victor's hand was gripping Thomas's arm. Tightly. What happened next? I asked. They walked to a black SUV, Lucas said. Then they drove away. I leaned back in my chair. My mind was racing now. None of this made sense. Thomas had been in a car crash. The police confirmed it. There was a funeral. A burial. A death certificate. So how could he be standing outside a grocery store yesterday? And why was he with Victor Hale? I needed answers. Immediately. So that evening I called my son Daniel. He arrived about 20 minutes later with Melissa. Both of them looked concerned when they walked into the kitchen. Mom, what's wrong? Daniel asked. I didn't say anything. I simply turned Lucas's phone around and slid it across the table. Look at this. Daniel glanced at the screen. Then something strange happened. He froze. Not confused. Not shocked. Frozen. For a brief moment, the color drained from his face. Then he pushed the phone away. That's not Dad, he said quickly. My eyebrows lifted. You barely looked at it. It's just someone who looks like him, Daniel said. But Lucas said. Kids imagine things. His voice was sharp now. Too sharp. And that's when I noticed something else. Daniel never once picked up the phone to examine the picture more closely. Not once. Instead, he stood up from the table. Mom, you need to let this go, he said. Dad is gone. The room went quiet. But something inside me had shifted. Because Daniel didn't sound sad. He sounded scared. And later that night, after everyone left, I sat down at my computer and decided to read the official accident report for myself. At first it looked routine. Vehicle fire. Fatality confirmed. Case closed. But then I reached the section about identification. And one sentence made my stomach drop. The victim had been identified through dental records. I stared at the screen for a long time. Because there was just one problem with that. A problem nobody else in town would know. My husband hadn't been to a dentist in 5 years. Which meant one thing. Those dental records shouldn't even exist. And if the body in that car wasn't Thomas, then the question becomes terrifying. Who was actually buried in my husband's grave? Let's stop for a second and think about this. If the body in that car wasn't my husband, then who was it? That question kept circling in my mind the entire night. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the same three things repeating in my head like a loop. The photo Lucas took. Victor Hale standing beside Thomas. And the line in the crash report about dental records that shouldn't exist. By morning, I realized something important. If I wanted answers, I couldn't wait for someone else to give them to me. I had to start digging myself. So I did the first thing that made sense. I drove to the crash site. Highway 17 runs along the edge of Maplewood. A two-lane road surrounded by tall pine trees and long stretches of empty farmland. It's quiet most of the day, but at night the road gets dark and lonely. According to the police report, Thomas's accident happened on a curve about 5 miles outside town. When I arrived, the area looked ordinary. Too ordinary. I parked my car on the shoulder and stepped out. The wind was cold that morning, pushing through the trees with a low rustling sound. Cars occasionally passed behind me, but otherwise the road felt strangely empty. The report said Thomas's car had slammed into the guardrail before catching fire. But when I walked toward the rail, something didn't feel right. The metal was barely damaged. There were a few scratches. A bent section maybe a foot wide. But if a car had crashed hard enough to kill someone instantly, shouldn't there be more damage? I stood there staring at it, trying to picture what the accident must have looked like. And the image didn't match. Not even close. Then I noticed something else. The burn marks. They were on the asphalt several feet away from the guardrail. Which made no sense. If the car hit the rail and caught fire, why were the burn marks sitting out in the middle of the road? That was the moment a cold thought crept into my mind. What if there wasn't an accident at all? What if someone wanted it to look like one? The question made my stomach twist. Because if that was true, then whoever staged it had done a very convincing job. I got back into my car and drove straight to the Maplewood Police Department. The building was small. Only a handful of officers worked there, and most of them had known my family for years. When I stepped inside, the receptionist looked up. "Mrs. Whitaker? Is everything okay?" "I need to speak with whoever handled my husband's accident," I said. A few minutes later I was sitting across from Detective Carla Ruiz. Carla Ruiz was about 45 years old, with sharp eyes and a calm voice that made people feel like she was always studying the room. She had been the investigator assigned to Thomas's crash. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said as we sat down. I nodded. But I didn't waste time. "I believe my husband might still be alive." Her expression didn't change. Not immediately. But I could tell she wasn't expecting those words. "I know how that sounds," I continued. "But I need you to look at something." I placed Lucas's phone on her desk. Ruiz leaned forward. For a moment she said nothing. Her eyes moved slowly across the screen. Then she looked up at me again. "When was this taken?" "Yesterday," I said. The room went very quiet. Ruiz picked up the phone again, zooming into the image. I watched her closely. And I noticed something interesting. She didn't dismiss it. She didn't say it was impossible. Instead, she asked a question. "Where did you say this was taken?" "Maplewood Market." Ruiz leaned back in her chair. "That's strange," she murmured. "What is?" She hesitated. Then she opened a folder on her desk. The accident report had a few irregularities. My heart skipped. "Irregularities?" "The vehicle was registered to Thomas Whitaker," she said. "But when we recovered it, the VIN plate had been partially melted." I frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means we couldn't confirm the car's identity the usual way." She flipped a page in the file. The paperwork verifying ownership was submitted by a family member. A cold feeling spread through my chest. Which family member? Ruiz looked up. Your son. Daniel Whitaker. For a moment I couldn't speak. Daniel handled the paperwork? Why? Ruiz continued. The body was severely burned. Identification relied on dental records that were provided during the report process. My pulse quickened. But those records shouldn't exist, I said. Ruiz studied my face carefully. Why do you say that? Because Thomas hasn't been to a dentist in years. Now her expression changed. Not shock. Concern. The kind of concern an investigator gets when a case suddenly stops making sense. Mrs. Whitaker, she said slowly, are you certain about that? Yes. Ruiz closed the folder. Then she said something that made my chest tighten. This case was processed very quickly. How quickly? The funeral home received the remains within 48 hours. That was fast. Too fast. And suddenly the whole situation felt less like an accident, and more like something carefully arranged. I drove home with 1,000 thoughts racing through my mind. But before I could even sit down, Daniel arrived at the house. He must have heard from the police station. He walked in without knocking. Mom, he said sharply. Why are you talking to detectives? I stepped closer. Because I saw the photo. Daniel's face tightened. That picture doesn't mean anything. Then look at it. I held the phone out. This time he did look. And his reaction told me everything. Not grief. Not confusion. Fear. Real fear. Mom, he said quietly, you need to stop this. Stop what? Digging. That word hung in the air between us. And suddenly I realized something terrifying. Daniel wasn't worried I was wrong. He was worried I might be right. That night, after Daniel left, I sat alone in the garage. Thomas's old toolbox sat on the workbench where he always kept it. For years I had watched him open that same red metal box while fixing engines or tightening bolts. I don't know why, but something told me to open it. Inside were the usual things. Wrenches. Screwdrivers. Oil-stained gloves. But tucked into the back corner, beneath a folded rag, was a small envelope. My name was written on the front. Ellie. My hand started trembling. I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper in Thomas's handwriting. The message was short. If anything happens to me, do not trust Daniel. My heart slammed in my chest. But that wasn't the strangest part. Because when I turned the note over, there was something written on the back. A location. Old Riverside Warehouse. And underneath it, a time. Thursday, 6 p.m. Which would have meant nothing. Except for one chilling detail. Thursday was tomorrow. What would you do if you discovered a message from your dead husband, telling you exactly where to find him? Would you go? Or would you stay home and pretend none of it existed? Because that night, sitting in the garage with Thomas's note trembling in my hands, I realized something important. If I ignored it, I might never learn the truth. And if I went, everything I believed about my family might collapse. But by then, the questions were too loud to ignore. Why did Thomas warn me not to trust Daniel? Why was Victor Hale standing beside him in Lucas's photo? And most disturbing of all, why did it feel like my husband had been planning something before he died? Thursday arrived faster than I expected. The entire day felt unreal. I tried to distract myself by doing normal things. Making coffee. Watering the plants. Watching the morning news. But none of it worked. My eyes kept drifting to the clock. 3:10 p.m. 4:22 p.m. 5:03 p.m. Every minute pulled me closer to that warehouse. Finally, at 5:15, I made a decision. I picked up my phone and called Detective Carla Ruiz. When she answered, I didn't bother with small talk. I found something, I told her. 20 minutes later, I was sitting across from her again at the station, showing her Thomas's note. Ruiz read it twice. Then she leaned back in her chair, thinking. You believe this means your husband is meeting someone tonight? She asked. I don't believe, I said quietly. I know. Ruiz studied me for a moment. Then she nodded. All right. Let's check it out. Riverside Warehouse sat on the far edge of Maplewood's industrial district. A row of old brick buildings near the river that used to store farm equipment decades ago. Most of them were abandoned now. Broken windows. Rusty loading docks. The kind of place nobody visits unless they have a reason. Ruiz and I arrived just before 6. She parked an unmarked police car behind a row of dumpsters where we could see the entrance without being obvious. The sky was starting to darken. Long shadows stretched across the empty parking lot. For a while, nothing happened. The warehouse looked completely deserted. Wind rattled a loose metal sheet on the roof, making a dull clanging sound every few seconds. Ruiz checked her watch. 6:04. My heart was pounding so loudly I could feel it in my throat. What if he doesn't show up? I asked. Ruiz didn't answer. Instead she pointed toward the road. Headlights were approaching. A black SUV turned slowly into the lot. My stomach dropped. I recognized that vehicle instantly. Victor Hale's SUV. The car rolled forward and stopped near the warehouse entrance. The engine shut off. For a moment no one got out. Then the driver's door opened. Victor Hale stepped out first. Tall. Confident. Wearing a dark coat that moved slightly in the wind. He looked exactly like the man in Lucas's photo. Ruiz leaned forward slightly in her seat. Well, she murmured. That's interesting. But then the passenger door opened. And the world seemed to freeze. A man stepped out. Thinner than I remembered. His shoulders slightly hunched. His gray hair catching the fading light. My breath left my lungs. It was Thomas. Alive. Standing right there in front of me. After a week of believing he was buried underground. After a funeral. After grief that felt like it had hollowed out my chest. There he was. Talking quietly with Victor Hale. Ruiz grabbed my arm. Stay in the car, she whispered. But it was too late. 45 years of marriage doesn't let you sit still when you see someone you love standing 20 yards away. I opened the door. Mrs. Whitaker, Ruiz started. But I was already walking across the lot. My voice came out before I could stop it. Thomas. Both men turned. The look on Thomas's face was something I will never forget. Shock. Pure shock. Like he had just seen a ghost. Eleanor, he whispered. I stopped a few feet away. You're alive. The words felt unreal leaving my mouth. Victor Hale's eyes narrowed slightly as he looked between us. Well, he said calmly, this is unexpected. Thomas stepped forward quickly. You weren't supposed to come here, he said. Then maybe you shouldn't have left me a map, I replied. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Detective Ruiz walked up beside me. Victor Hale, she said evenly. Mind explaining what's going on here? Victor gave a small smile. I'm afraid I have no idea what you're talking about. Thomas looked at me again. And this time, the fear in his eyes was obvious. I'm sorry, Ellie, he said quietly. I thought this would protect you. Protect me from what? I demanded. Thomas took a deep breath. Then he looked at Victor. And finally said the words that began unraveling everything. From him. Ruiz crossed her arms. Start talking. Thomas nodded slowly. Victor Hale discovered something under our property, he said. Something valuable. My confusion deepened. What do you mean? Oil. The word hung in the air. Ruiz blinked. Oil? Thomas nodded. Preliminary surveys showed a deposit under our land. Millions of dollars worth. I stared at him. And Victor wanted it. Yes. But you refused to sell, I said. Thomas looked down. At first. Victor chuckled softly beside him. People's positions tend to evolve. Thomas continued. Victor approached Daniel. Your son had been losing money in some bad investments. My stomach turned. Daniel owed more than he could pay. Victor smiled faintly. So we made a deal. Thomas's voice tightened. The plan was simple. Fake my death in a car crash. Transfer the land rights quietly. Then I'd disappear until everything was finalized. I felt like the ground beneath me had vanished. You agreed to this? Thomas's eyes filled with regret. Victor threatened to expose Daniel's financial fraud. He would have gone to prison. Ruiz looked toward Victor. That's blackmail. Victor shrugged. Negotiation. Thomas looked back at me. I thought if I disappeared, it would solve everything. But then, Ruiz asked, why meet here tonight? Thomas's face darkened. Because 2 days ago, I overheard Victor talking on the phone. Victor's smile faded slightly. Thomas continued. He said once the land deal was finished, he'd deal with the loose end. Ruiz stepped forward. You mean you? Thomas nodded. He was planning to kill me. Victor sighed. Well, that complicates things. Police sirens suddenly echoed in the distance. Ruiz had called backup earlier. Victor glanced toward the road as flashing lights approached. Then he looked back at us calmly. You know, he said quietly, none of this would have happened if people simply understood the value of opportunity. Officers surrounded the lot within seconds. Victor Hale was placed in handcuffs. Thomas stood silently beside me. Alive. Real. But as the police led Victor away, one final question burned in my mind. I turned to Thomas. There's something I still don't understand. He looked at me. Why didn't you tell me the truth from the beginning? Thomas hesitated. And when he finally answered, his voice was barely above a whisper. Because Victor said if I warned you. He swallowed hard. You would be the first person he'd make disappear.